Somewhere beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, two steel giants are holding their breath. No radar can find them. No satellite can track them. No one above the water even knows they exist in that moment. One is American, one is Soviet. Both are armed with enough nuclear firepower to end civilization several times over. And they are stalking each other, silently, patiently, with the cold precision of professional killers, through absolute darkness, miles below the surface of the sea. This is not a movie, this is not fiction. This happened, over and over again for nearly 5 decades beneath every ocean on this planet. Submarines from two superpowers played the most dangerous game in human history, a game where the stakes were not just the lives of the crews aboard, but the fate of every living person on Earth. One wrong move, one misread signal, one panicking commander, and the world ends. Welcome to the silent war, the one that never made the front pages. The one that the governments of both nations hid from their own people. The war that was fought in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean, where pressure kills, where silence is survival, and where the men inside those steel tubes lived for months at a time knowing that at any moment the order could come or the enemy could strike first. Most people know about the space race. Most people have heard of the arms race. But very few people truly understand what was happening beneath the waves during the Cold War. And when you understand it, truly understand it, it will change the way you think about how close this world came to nuclear annihilation. So let us go back to the beginning. The year is 1945. The Second World War has just ended. Two nations stand above the rubble of the old world order. The United States of America, the undisputed master of surface naval power, possessing the largest and most powerful fleet ever assembled in human history. And the Soviet Union, a land empire of staggering size and ferocity, which had bled more than any other nation in the war and emerged from the carnage with an iron determination to never be vulnerable again. Both nations had seen what submarines could do in the war. German U-boats had nearly strangled Britain to death, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping, sending thousands of sailors to the bottom of the Atlantic. The Japanese had used submarines with devastating effect in the Pacific, and the Americans had used their submarines to absolutely annihilate Japanese shipping, cutting off the island empire from its resources and accelerating its collapse. Submarines were no longer just weapons. They were the weapons, and both superpowers knew it. But here is what changed everything. Here is the moment that turned the submarine from a tactical weapon into an apocalyptic one. On the 6th of August, 1945, a single American bomber dropped a single bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The city ceased to exist. One bomb, one plane, one city gone. Within weeks of that event, every military strategist in both Washington and Moscow was asking the same question. What if you could put that weapon on a submarine? What if you could hide a nuclear bomb in the ocean, where no one could find it, where no first strike could destroy it, where it could survive any attack and still come back to end the world? What if you could make nuclear annihilation invisible, untraceable, unstoppable? That question is what drove the next 50 years of submarine development. That question is what sent thousands of men into the darkness of the deep ocean. That question is what created the most terrifying weapon systems ever devised by the human mind. The Americans moved first. They had the head start. They had the bomb, and they had a navy that had spent the entire war refining its submarine capabilities. The USS Nautilus, launched in 1954, was the first nuclear-powered submarine in history, and this changed everything in ways that most people still do not fully appreciate. Before nuclear propulsion, submarines were really just surface ships that could dive temporarily. They had diesel engines for surface travel and electric batteries for underwater travel, but the batteries only lasted so long. A submarine running on battery power could stay underwater for maybe a day or two before it had to surface and run its diesel engines to recharge. And the moment it surfaced, it was visible, it was vulnerable, it could be found. Nuclear propulsion eliminated that limitation entirely. The USS Nautilus did not need to surface. It could stay underwater for months. The only thing that limited its time beneath the ocean was the amount of food its crew could carry. This was not an evolution. This was a revolution. The submarine was no longer a ship that could dive. It was now a creature of the deep, something that belonged underwater, something that surface forces could not easily chase, find, or kill. Nautilus proved this immediately and dramatically. In 1958, the Nautilus sailed beneath the Arctic ice cap, and became the first vessel in history to reach the geographic North Pole. Think about what that meant. It passed beneath the frozen roof of the world in complete silence, completely invisible, in waters where no surface ship could operate. It demonstrated that a nuclear submarine could go anywhere on the planet, anywhere, and no one could stop it. The Soviets were watching. And the Soviets were furious. Stalin had died in 1953, but his obsession with military power lived on in his successors. Nikita Khrushchev understood that the Soviet Union could not match American surface naval power. The Americans had too many aircraft carriers, too many destroyers, too many bases around the world. But submarines were the great equalizer. A submarine did not need a base. It did not need an escort. It did not need air cover. It needed only the ocean, and the ocean covered 70% of the Earth. The Soviets threw everything they had into submarine development. And when the Soviets threw everything they had at a problem, they did not do it halfway. By the late 1950s, Soviet submarine construction was proceeding at a pace that shocked American naval intelligence. They were building submarines faster than the Americans had ever seen any nation build them. Dozens, then scores, then hundreds. These were not the refined, elegant machines that American engineers were producing. Soviet submarines were often loud, leaky, and uncomfortable beyond imagination. The crews who served on them endured conditions that would have been considered unacceptable by American standards. But they were numerous, and they were dangerous, and they were getting better every year. The first generation of Soviet nuclear submarines, designated by NATO as the November class, entered service in 1958. They were terrifying to look at on paper, nuclear-powered, armed with torpedoes and early cruise missiles, capable of staying underwater for extended periods. But they were also extraordinarily dangerous to their own crews. The engineering on the nuclear reactors was crude by American standards. Radiation leaks were common. Sailors were exposed to doses that would horrify modern nuclear safety experts. Several early Soviet submarines suffered reactor accidents that killed crew members. One of the most haunting stories from this era involves a submarine whose name most people in the West have never heard. The K-19 was a Soviet Hotel-class ballistic missile submarine, one of the first Soviet boats capable of launching nuclear missiles from beneath the ocean surface. In July of 1961, the K-19 was on patrol in the North Atlantic when its reactor cooling system failed. The reactor began to overheat. Without intervention, it would melt down. A nuclear explosion in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, or at minimum a catastrophic release of radiation, would follow. The captain faced an impossible choice. He could surface and call for help, which would expose a top-secret Soviet nuclear submarine to American forces who were almost certainly nearby. Or he could ask his crew to attempt an emergency repair that would expose them to lethal doses of radiation. He chose the repair. A team of engineers worked inside the reactor compartment without proper radiation protection. They improvised cooling systems using whatever they had on hand. They saved the submarine. And within weeks, every one of them was dead from radiation poisoning. The oldest of them was 28 years old. The Americans called K-19 Hiroshima, their dark nickname for a submarine they had heard about through intelligence channels. The Soviets called it something else. They called it the Widowmaker. It was not the last Soviet submarine to earn that name. But let us set aside the tragedies for a moment, because what was happening in these years was not just tragedy. It was also a kind of dark genius. Both nations, through competition and fear and determination, were pushing the technology of submarine warfare to places no one had imagined possible just a decade before. The Americans, building on the success of the Nautilus, launched the USS George Washington in 1959. This was a different kind of submarine. This was not a hunter. This was a strategic deterrent, a ballistic missile submarine, or SSBN, carrying 16 Polaris nuclear missiles. Each missile could travel over 1,000 miles and detonate with the force of hundreds of Hiroshima bombs. And this submarine could hide anywhere in the world's oceans, fire its missiles from beneath the surface, and disappear again before anyone could respond. This was the second strike weapon, the survivable nuclear force, the thing that made nuclear war, in the terrible calculus of deterrence, effectively unwinnable for anyone who started it. If the Soviets launched a first strike and destroyed every American city, every American air base, every American missile silo, the ballistic missile submarines would still be out there, hidden in the deep ocean, waiting, and they would fire. The strategic logic was brutally simple. No rational leader would start a nuclear war if he knew it meant his own nation's destruction, even if he destroyed his enemy first. The submarines made that guarantee absolute. As long as they survived, and beneath the ocean, they always survived. Nuclear war meant mutual annihilation. The acronym that defense planners used for this doctrine was MAD, mutually assured destruction, and it was not a mistake that the acronym spelled that word. The Soviets understood this immediately. Within 3 years, they had their own ballistic missile submarines at sea. The game had shifted. Now both sides had the ultimate weapon hidden in the ocean. Now both sides needed to know where the other side's submarines were at all times, because in the event of a crisis, you might need to kill them before they could fire. And so the hunt began. This is where the story becomes something extraordinary, something that sounds impossible, but is documented and verified, and in some cases still classified. The hunt for enemy submarines became the primary mission of entire fleets. Destroyers, aircraft, long-range patrol planes, and crucially, attack submarines, the fast, deadly hunter-killer boats whose entire purpose was to find, and if war came, destroy the enemy's ballistic missile submarines. The Americans had the Los Angeles class. The Soviets had the Victor class and later the Akula class. These were not missile platforms. These were predators. Stripped down, fast, quiet, armed with torpedoes and anti-submarine missiles, crewed by the most skilled submariners in the world. Their captains had complete authority in their little steel worlds. No radio contact, no orders from above, just the mission, find them, track them, and if the order comes, kill them. And they did find each other. Again and again, in operations so secret that most of them are still classified decades later, American and Soviet submarines found each other in the deep ocean and played games of cat and mouse that lasted for days, sometimes weeks. They trailed each other. They listened to each other. They got so close that the sound of the other submarine's propellers filled the control room like a heartbeat. There is a specific phenomenon that submariners from this era describe, and it is called a snapshot. A snapshot was the moment during a trailing operation when an attack submarine had the enemy directly in its sights, could have fired a torpedo that would have ended the trail and ended the other crew's lives. During the Cold War, American and Soviet submarines had each other in snapshot position multiple times. Every time, the order to fire did not come, but the capability was there. The targeting solution was there. The weapons were ready. Only discipline and doctrine and the absence of a shooting war held the trigger unpulled. Let us talk about the technology of listening, because this is central to everything. Submarines in the Cold War did not fight with their eyes. They fought with their ears. Sound is the primary medium of communication and detection in the underwater world. Light travels poorly through water. Radio waves cannot penetrate below the surface. But sound, low-frequency sound, can travel thousands of miles through the ocean, following paths called SOFAR channels, where temperature and pressure conspire to guide acoustic waves across entire ocean basins. The Americans figured this out first and built SOSUS, the sound surveillance system, a network of hydrophone arrays planted on the ocean floor across the Atlantic and Pacific, connected by undersea cables to shore stations where analysts listened continuously for the acoustic signatures of Soviet submarines. When a Soviet submarine left port and entered the open ocean, SOSUS heard it. When it changed depth, SOSUS heard it. When its machinery made a distinctive sound, a cavitation pattern, a bearing wobble, a unique frequency from a particular pump, SOSUS cataloged that sound and gave that submarine a name, an identity, a file. This system was extraordinary. A Soviet submarine could be operating thousands of miles away, in complete darkness, without any contact with the surface world, and the Americans would know exactly where it was based on nothing but the sounds it made. This was not science fiction. This was operational reality by the mid-1960s. The Soviets knew something like this had to exist, because their submarines kept being found, kept being trailed, kept running into American submarines in places where coincidence seemed statistically impossible. But they did not know the details. And then, in one of the most damaging intelligence betrayals in American history, they found out. John Walker was a communications specialist in the United States Navy. For nearly 2 decades, from 1967 to 1985, he sold Soviet intelligence some of the most sensitive secrets in American possession. Among other things, he revealed details about American cryptographic capabilities and acoustic intelligence. The Soviets used this information to begin redesigning their submarines, quieting the mechanical signatures that SOSUS was tracking, changing their operational patterns to avoid the hydrophone arrays. The damage that Walker did to American submarine intelligence was, according to officials who assessed it afterwards, incalculable. Some analysts believe that Walker's espionage moved Soviet submarine capabilities forward by a decade or more, but the Americans did not rely only on SOSUS. They also had attack submarines, and the attack submarines had their own sensors, their own acoustic expertise, their own cat and mouse skills. And the men who operated those submarines developed, through years of practice and operational experience, an almost supernatural ability to hear, identify, and track Soviet submarines. There is a famous incident, famous in the small community of submarine veterans who are permitted to talk about these things, involving an American submarine that trailed a Soviet ballistic missile boat for so long and so closely that when the Soviet submarine eventually returned to port, the American boat was still behind it, close enough to hear the anchor chain running out. The Soviet captain did not know. His crew did not know. For the duration of that patrol, they had been shadowed by a hunter they could not detect. Conversely, the Soviets were not helpless. They had their own acoustic systems, their own skilled submariners, and a determination born from the terrifying knowledge that American submarines were out there, in their waters, listening. Soviet attack submarines escorted their ballistic missile boats out of port, watching for American submarines that might be waiting to trail the missile boat once it left the harbor approaches. The Soviets also developed their own SOSUS equivalent, a series of hydrophone arrays along their coastlines and in the Arctic Ocean that tracked American submarines operating in Soviet-adjacent waters, and the Soviets had a secret weapon, a catastrophic one from the American perspective that they did not know about until 1983. The Soviets had managed to build a submarine so quiet that American detection systems could barely find it. The Alpha class had entered service in the late 1970s. It was made of titanium, more expensive and harder to work with than steel, but lighter and non-magnetic, making it extremely difficult to detect by some sensors. It was also extraordinarily fast, capable of speeds that no American submarine could match. At top speed, an Alpha-class submarine could outrun the torpedoes that most American submarines carried at that time. Think about what that means. You find it, you shoot at it, and it runs away faster than your weapon can travel. The Americans were genuinely alarmed. The Soviet submarine program, which they had been comfortable tracking and understanding through the 1960s and early 1970s, had suddenly produced something they did not fully understand and could not easily kill. The Alpha class forced a rapid reassessment of American torpedo technology and drove the development of faster, smarter weapons. But the Alpha class had a weakness. It was loud. The liquid metal cooling system for its reactor produced distinctive sounds that SOSUS and American attack submarines could identify. Quiet but dangerous was the Soviet ideal. The Alpha was fast but noisy. Then came the Aquila. The Aquila class, entering service in the mid-1980s, was different. It was quiet. Not as quiet as the best American submarines, but far, far quieter than anything the Soviets had produced before. And the reason it was quiet was another spy story, another intelligence catastrophe, this one involving the Toshiba Corporation of Japan, which had illegally sold the Soviet Union advanced computer-controlled milling machinery that allowed them to produce submarine propellers with a precision that dramatically reduced cavitation noise. The United States discovered this sale in 1987, and the congressional fury was extraordinary. Toshiba was barred from selling products to U.S. government agencies. Sanctions were imposed, but the damage was done. The Soviet submarine fleet had taken another enormous leap forward in stealth. The Americans pushed back. The Seawolf class, designed in the late 1980s, was the quietest attack submarine ever built. Its acoustic signature was so low that it was genuinely difficult to detect even by the best passive sonar systems available. It was also extraordinarily capable in every dimension: speed, depth, weapons load, sensor suite. The Seawolf was designed specifically to hunt the Aquila and to survive in the most heavily defended Soviet submarine bastions, a Soviet submarine bastion. This is a concept that most people have never heard of, but it is central to understanding what the Cold War looked like from below the waves. As the Soviet ballistic missile submarine force grew through the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviets changed their strategy. Rather than sending their missile submarines on wide ocean patrols where they would be exposed to American hunters, they began keeping them close to home in areas surrounded by Arctic ice, defended by shore-based aircraft, surface ships, and attack submarines. Under the ice of the Barents Sea, protected by layers of defenses, Soviet ballistic missile submarines would wait in relative safety for the order to fire. This made the American problem both harder and simpler. Harder because these bastions were defended, and penetrating them was enormously dangerous. An American submarine operating inside a Soviet bastion was in hostile territory, surrounded by forces actively trying to find and kill it. Simpler because now at least you knew roughly where the missile submarines were. They were not wandering freely across the world's oceans. You could position your hunter-killers to intercept them, and the Americans did. American attack submarines regularly penetrated the Barents Sea bastion. They operated for weeks at a time in waters that the Soviets considered their own backyard. They collected intelligence, acoustic recordings, electronic emissions, photographs through the periscope of Soviet facilities and ships. They tracked Soviet submarines. They were, in every meaningful sense of the word, spying, and some of them were doing something else. Some of them were tapping Soviet underwater communication cables. Operation Ivy Bells is one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the Cold War. Beginning in the early 1970s, American submarines located an underwater communication cable running along the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk, connecting Soviet Pacific Fleet facilities. Navy divers, in waters the Soviets believed were secure, attached a recording device to the cable. Periodically, an American submarine would return, retrieve the tapes, and replace them with fresh ones. For years, the United States was listening to routine Soviet military communications on a cable that the Soviets believed was perfectly secure, because it had no radio emissions, because it was at the bottom of the sea, because surely no one could get to it. Operation Ivy Bells ran until 1981, when it was betrayed, again by a spy. Ronald Pelton, an NSA employee, sold the information to the Soviets for money. Soviets went back to the cable, found the device, and removed it. But not before the Americans had spent nearly a decade listening to communications the Soviets never imagined could be intercepted. These operations, Ivy Bells, the Barents penetrations, the SOSUS network, the development of the Seawolf, represent an intelligence and operational effort of staggering scale, and it was all happening in complete silence. No press conferences, no victory parades, no acknowledgement. Just men in steel tubes, in the dark, doing things that the civilized world was not supposed to know about. Now let us talk about some of the specific incidents, the moments when the cold game of cat and mouse became something far more dangerous. In October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. Everyone knows the public story: Kennedy and Khrushchev, the missiles in Cuba, the naval blockade, the 13 days of tension that nearly ended human civilization. But there is a part of this story that almost no one knows, and it involves submarines. The Soviets had sent 4 Foxtrot-class submarines to the Caribbean in support of the Cuban operation. These were diesel-electric boats, not nuclear, but they were armed. Each carried a conventional torpedoes, and though this was not known to the Americans at the time, at least one nuclear-armed torpedo with a yield of roughly 15 kilotons. The same explosive force as the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The American Navy found these submarines and began forcing them to surface by dropping practice depth charges, non-lethal explosives that were intended as signals, as demands to surface and identify yourself. On board B-59, one of the 4 submarines, conditions had become desperate. The boat had been underwater for days in tropical water. The air conditioning had failed. Temperatures inside the submarine had risen to over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were dangerously high. Men were fainting at their posts. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, had been out of radio contact with Moscow for days and did not know whether nuclear war had already begun. When the American depth charges started hitting the water, Savitsky made a decision. He would fire his nuclear torpedo. Under Soviet doctrine at that time, authorization to use nuclear weapons in such circumstances required the agreement of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander who was embarked on this submarine. The captain and the political officer agreed. They wanted to fire. The flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. Vasily Arkhipov refused. He argued for restraint. He argued for surfacing, for making contact with Moscow, for finding out what was actually happening before taking an action that could not be undone. He prevailed. B-59 surfaced. It was met by American destroyers. It did not fire. Years later, when this story became known, it prompted one senior American official to say this: "The man who may have saved the world is Vasily Arkhipov. One man, one decision." In a submarine at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, that is how close it came. Let us move forward to 1968, a year of extraordinary tragedy in the submarine world. In that single year, 4 submarines, 2 American, 1 Soviet, 1 Israeli, were lost at sea under circumstances that were never fully explained. 2 of them, 1 from each superpower, have particular relevance to our story. The USS Scorpion was an American nuclear attack submarine that disappeared in May 1968 in the Atlantic Ocean with 99 men aboard. The Navy spent months searching for it. When the wreck was eventually located, the cause of its sinking remained uncertain. The most widely accepted theory involves a torpedo malfunction. A weapon that armed itself inside the tube began running hot and either exploded or forced the crew into an emergency procedure that resulted in the loss of the boat. But there are those who have argued, and continue to argue, that the Scorpion was lost in an encounter with a Soviet submarine. The official position of the United States Navy is that no enemy action was involved. The classified details of the investigation are still not fully public. What is known is that the Scorpion was operating in an area where Soviet naval forces were also present, and that its final hours are not entirely accounted for. 99 men went to the bottom of the Atlantic. And the complete truth of how may never be known. The Soviet K-129 was lost in the Pacific in March of 1968, just months before the Scorpion. It was a Gulf-class ballistic missile submarine carrying nuclear weapons. Its loss with all 98 hands aboard was a catastrophe for the Soviet Navy and a mystery that has never been completely resolved. The official Soviet position at the time was to deny that anything had happened at all. Privately, the Soviet military conducted a massive search operation. The Americans found the wreck first. SOSUS had recorded the sounds of the submarine's destruction, a distinctive acoustic signature that allowed the Navy to calculate the location with remarkable precision. What followed is one of the most extraordinary intelligence operations in history, Project Azorian. The CIA, working with the billionaire Howard Hughes as cover, built a giant ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, ostensibly for deep-sea mining. In 1974, this ship positioned itself over the wreck of K-129 and attempted to raise it using a massive claw system built into its hull. The operation was conducted in complete secrecy. The cover story was mining. Soviet ships came to look. They were not told what was happening beneath them. The raising operation partially succeeded. The front section of K-129 came up before the claw mechanism broke, and part of the submarine fell back to the ocean floor. What was recovered, including 2 nuclear warheads, cryptographic equipment, and the remains of Soviet sailors, was a significant intelligence gain. The full details of what was recovered remain classified. The Soviets, to this day, have never been officially told the complete story of what the United States did with the remains of their sailors and their weapons. By the early 1980s, the submarine war had reached a new intensity. The Reagan administration came into office with an aggressive naval policy that directly challenged Soviet maritime strategy. The maritime strategy, as it was called, contemplated sending American carrier battle groups and attack submarines deep into Soviet waters at the very beginning of any conflict, striking Soviet naval bases, sinking Soviet submarines, and destroying the Soviet Navy's ability to operate in the open ocean. This was profoundly alarming to the Soviets. The maritime strategy was not a secret. It was discussed openly in American defense publications. And what it meant, from the Soviet perspective, was that the Americans were planning to come after their ballistic missile submarines in the bastions. The thing that the Soviets had built their entire nuclear deterrent around, the survivability of their submarine-based missiles, was being directly threatened. This contributed to a Soviet strategic paranoia that peaked in the early 1980s in an operation codenamed RYAN. RYAN was a Soviet intelligence operation specifically designed to detect preparations for an American nuclear first strike. The Soviets were genuinely worried that the United States might attempt to launch a surprise attack, destroy Soviet nuclear forces in their bastions, and win a nuclear war. Their submarines were on a higher alert than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Their intelligence services were watching for signs that the Americans were getting ready to move. And then, in November of 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83. This exercise was designed to simulate the procedures for authorizing and launching nuclear weapons. It was realistic, more realistic than previous exercises. Some elements of the exercise appeared, to Soviet intelligence, disturbingly similar to the preparations for an actual first strike. Soviet nuclear forces went to an elevated alert status during Able Archer. Submarines were put on standby. There were Soviet officers who believed during those days that nuclear war might actually be imminent. Again, the world came closer to the edge than the public knew. Again, the submarine force was at the center of the story. One of the men who was perhaps most responsible for preventing that situation from escalating was Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB officer who was secretly working as a British intelligence asset. Gordievsky was reporting back that Soviet leadership genuinely feared a NATO attack, and this intelligence allowed the British and eventually the Americans to understand that the Soviets were not bluffing, that the paranoia was real, that the exercises needed to be scaled back, that the rhetoric needed to be moderated. Reagan, who received intelligence derived from Gordievsky's reporting, was reportedly genuinely alarmed to learn how frightened the Soviet leadership actually was. Submarines were part of that fear. The presence of American attack submarines in Soviet waters, the constant trailing of Soviet ballistic missile boats, the penetration of the bastions, all of this had convinced the Soviet military that the Americans were preparing to fight and win a nuclear war. The submarines that were designed to prevent war were, paradoxically, contributing to the risk of it. Let us talk about the human dimension of all this, because it is easy in a discussion of strategy and technology and geopolitics to forget the men who actually lived this story. A submarine on a Cold War patrol was a world of its own. You entered through a hatch in the conning tower, and the world above you, sky, sun, news, family, everything you knew ceased to exist. You would not see it again for 70, 90, sometimes 120 days. The interior of a nuclear submarine smelled of diesel and cooking oil and the particular human smell of a closed space. It was loud with the sounds of machinery that never stopped, the hum of the reactor cooling pumps, the whisper of ventilation, the occasional ping of sonar. And it was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the enemy. Fire was the great terror. In a submarine, fire consumed oxygen that could not be replaced, and toxic smoke filled spaces too small to escape. Several submarines, both American and Soviet, suffered catastrophic fires that killed crew members. The Soviet Yankee-class submarine K-19 lost a missile tube to a fuel explosion in October 1986 and eventually sank in the Atlantic. A young crew member, Sergei Preminin, manually shut down the submarine's reactor to prevent a nuclear explosion, an action that saved the lives of his crewmates, but from which he was unable to escape. He died trapped in the reactor compartment, alone, having just prevented a nuclear catastrophe in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He was 20 years old. American submariners lived with different kinds of fear. The fear of a mistake, of diving too deep and exceeding crushed depth, of a valve left open at the wrong moment, of a collision with the ocean floor. The fear of the enemy they could hear but not see. There are veterans of Cold War submarine patrols who describe the experience of trailing a Soviet submarine, the absolute silence of the control room, the headphones pressed against the ears of the sonar operators, the quiet voice reporting bearings and ranges, the captain's face unreadable. 90 days in the dark. 90 days of knowing that on the other side of a few hundred meters of water, another crew of men was doing exactly the same thing. They never met. They never spoke. The rules of engagement were clear. Do not fire unless fired upon. Do not surface unless necessary. "Do not reveal your presence." But there were moments when the rules stretched thin. Moments when the contact was close enough that the crews could hear each other's machinery with naked ears pressed against the hull. Moments when the geometry of two submarines maneuvering in three-dimensional space produced near collisions that sent men stumbling through narrow passageways, that cracked pipes and bent sonar arrays, and required emergency surfacing. These collisions were more common than either government ever admitted. American and Soviet submarines, operating in the same waters, sometimes literally ran into each other. In February 1992, after the Cold War had officially ended, the American submarine USS Baton Rouge collided with a Russian submarine near Murmansk. In March of that same year, the USS Grayling collided with another Russian submarine in the Barents Sea. These were not Cold War incidents. These were post-Cold War incidents. The habit of operating in the same dangerous proximity did not immediately end when the political confrontation did. And the worst of the Cold War-era collisions, or the ones we know about, happened in 1968 and again in 1969. Two Soviet submarines collided with American submarines in separate incidents in the Pacific Ocean. Neither sinking resulted, but men were injured, equipment was damaged, and neither government told its citizens what had happened. As the 1980s drew toward a close, the nature of the competition began to change. The Soviet economy, strained beyond endurance by the arms race and by the structural failures of central planning, was beginning to crack. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became General Secretary in 1985, understood that the Soviet Union could not continue to compete in every dimension with the United States while its economy was failing. He began a series of reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring that were intended to save Soviet socialism by modernizing it. What they did instead was begin to unravel the Soviet state. As openness spread, as the control systems of the Soviet Empire loosened, as the economies of Eastern Europe collapsed and their governments with them, as the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, the entire edifice that the Cold War had been built on began to dissolve. The submarine war did not stop immediately. Soviet submarines continued to patrol. American submarines continued to trail them. The intelligence operations continued. Old habits, old missions, old reflexes, these did not vanish overnight. But the intensity changed. The urgency faded. Funding for the Soviet Navy began to dry up as the Soviet government faced impossible economic pressures. Soviet submarines began spending more time in port. The patrols became less frequent, less far-ranging. And then, on December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on Soviet television and announced his resignation. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. In its place were 15 newly independent states, the largest of which, Russia, inherited the Soviet nuclear arsenal, including its submarine-based missiles, along with a navy that was rapidly becoming impossible to maintain. The contrast between what came next for the two navies is stark and telling. The United States Navy, while it reduced its force somewhat after the Cold War, maintained its submarine fleet in operational condition. The Virginia-class replaced the Los Angeles class. The Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines continued their patrols, maintaining the same decades-old routine of hiding in the ocean with their nuclear missiles, ensuring that deterrence remained credible. The Russian Navy, by contrast, suffered a catastrophic decline. Submarines sat in port for months, then years, because there was no money to pay for fuel, for maintenance, for training. Crews that had once been some of the most skilled professionals in any military went years without a proper patrol. Maintenance standards that had already been questionable during Soviet times collapsed entirely in many cases. The consequences were deadly. On August 12, 2000, the Russian nuclear-attack submarine Kursk was participating in a naval exercise in the Barents Sea when a defective practice torpedo exploded inside its torpedo room. The initial explosion was followed seconds later by a catastrophic detonation, the warheads of several other torpedoes detonating sympathetically, creating an explosion equivalent to a small conventional bomb inside the sealed pressure hull of the submarine. The Kursk sank in 108 meters of water. 118 men were aboard. Not all of them died immediately. 23 men survived the initial explosions and made their way to the stern compartment. They sealed themselves in. They had survival suits. they had emergency oxygen. The rescue mechanisms of the Russian state ground into motion, slowly, confusedly, hampered by equipment that had not been properly maintained, by pride that did not want to admit the extent of the disaster, by bureaucratic reflexes that substituted process for urgency. The Russians initially refused outside help. For days, while the world watched, the Russian Navy made unsuccessful attempts to dock rescue submarines with the stricken Kursk. The equipment malfunctioned. The hatches could not be opened. The windows of time in which the survivors might have been reached began to close. When Norway and Britain finally offered their rescue vehicles, vessels specifically designed for exactly this kind of emergency, the Russians hesitated. Politically, it was humiliating to accept help, but eventually, with international pressure and with the pressure of their own citizens' grief overwhelming the political calculation, Russia accepted. Norwegian divers reached the Kursk in hours. They opened the rescue hatch in minutes, and the compartment where the survivors had sheltered was flooded. They had all died, probably within the first few hours of the accident, from a chemical fire caused by a reaction between seawater and the chemicals in an emergency oxygen cartridge. The Kursk disaster revealed, in agonizing public detail, what the decline of the Russian Navy had cost, not just treasure and capability, but lives. Young men in their 20s and 30s, professionals, sailors, the best of what Russia had, died not because of an enemy, but because of neglect and dysfunction. The Cold War submarine competition had one final act, one last moment of extraordinary revelation. In 2000, a book was published, not a spy novel, not a work of fiction, but a carefully researched work of investigative journalism called Blind Man's Bluff by Sherry Sontag and Christopher Drew. For the first time, in carefully documented detail, the story of American Cold War submarine operations was told to the public. The SOSUS network, the cable tapping, the constant trailing of Soviet submarines, the near collisions, the intelligence operations, the extraordinary bravery and skill of the men who had done all of this in complete anonymity. Veterans who had never spoken about their service came forward. Classified documents were released. The shape of the hidden war beneath the oceans became, for the first time, visible to the people in whose name it had been fought. And what that book revealed, what the totality of the evidence reveals, when you look at everything together, is something genuinely astonishing. The United States won the submarine Cold War, not in any single dramatic battle, not in any moment of triumph or breakthrough, but in the patient, grinding, decades-long competition of technology and intelligence and seamanship. The American submarine force maintained a decisive edge over its Soviet counterpart. This was not inevitable. The Soviets had more submarines, had talented engineers and brave crews, had moments of genuine technological breakthroughs that alarmed and challenged the Americans. But the combination of American acoustic intelligence, superior manufacturing quality, better reactor engineering, and the remarkable human quality of the men who operated the boats gave the United States Navy a persistent advantage that the Soviets, for all their resources and determination, were never able to fully overcome. And perhaps more importantly, the system worked. The deterrence held. The submarines that were built to prevent nuclear war by making it unwinnable did prevent nuclear war. For 50 years, through crises that should by any rational calculation have produced catastrophic violence, Cuba, Able Archer, the Korean War, Vietnam, the Middle East conflicts, the nuclear deterrent held. The missiles stayed in their tubes. The submarines stayed in the dark. Whether this was wisdom or luck, or the accumulated effect of thousands of individual decisions by men who chose restraint over action, by men like Vasily Arkhipov who said no when the machinery of catastrophe was turning and could have said yes. That question does not have a clean answer. What we know is that we are here, that the world survived. That the men who spent their careers in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean, American and Soviet alike, performed a service to humanity that humanity will never fully understand, because it will never know what did not happen. These men are old now. Many of them are gone. They carried secrets for decades. They watched their friends die in accidents that their governments concealed. They went months without sunlight, without family, without the basic reassurances of the world above. They lived with the knowledge that at any moment, on any patrol, the order could come or the torpedo could hit. And they went back anyway, patrol after patrol, year after year, there is a phrase that submariners use, both American and Russian. There are only two kinds of ships, submarines and targets. It is a professional arrogance, a pride born from the knowledge that what they do is harder and more dangerous than almost anything else in military service. Beneath that arrogance is something else. A brotherhood that crosses national lines. When Russian submariners and American submariners meet today, at conferences, at veteran gatherings, in the writing of memoirs, there is a recognition that runs deeper than the Cold War, deeper than the competition. They know something about each other that no one else knows. They know what it means to be down there, in the dark. The ocean keeps its secrets. The wrecks of submarines lost during the Cold War, Scorpion, Thresher, K-129, K-278, and others, rest on the ocean floor, some in waters miles deep, undisturbed and unreachable. The men inside them are still there. They will be there forever. The ocean claimed them, and the ocean does not give back what it takes. When you stand at the edge of the water and look out at the sea, it looks peaceful, indifferent. It has looked that way through every war, every crisis, every moment of human terror and human courage that has ever been played out beneath its surface. It does not show you what it holds. It does not tell you what happened there. It is simply itself, deep and dark and vast, and utterly unconcerned with the small dramas of the creatures who have chosen to go beneath it. But beneath that peaceful surface, the Cold War happened. The most dangerous competition in human history happened. And the reason you are alive today, the reason nuclear weapons have never been used since 1945, the reason the Cold War ended without the apocalypse that seemed in so many moments to be one decision away, that reason is complicated and disputed by historians. But part of it, an important part of it, belongs to the submarines, to the boats that hid in the dark, to the crews that kept the silence, to the men on both sides who, when the moment came, chose to hold their fire. The silent war is over, the ocean is still deep, the secrets are still mostly secret, and somewhere out there, right now, submarines are still moving through the darkness, because the world has not yet found a better answer to the question of how you prevent the worst from happening. That answer still lives in the deep. Now here is a question for you. You have heard the full story of Vasily Arkhipov, the one Soviet officer who refused to authorize the firing of a nuclear torpedo during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and who may well have saved the world by that single decision. And you have heard about the countless moments where discipline, training, and individual courage held the line between Cold War and hot catastrophe. So here is what I want you to think about, and I want you to leave your honest answer in the comments below. If you had been in Arkhipov's position, alone, exhausted, in a submarine with failing air systems and depth charges exploding outside, out of contact with your government, not knowing whether nuclear war had already begun, would you have made the same choice? And does knowing this story change the way you think about the people, on both sides, who carried the weight of nuclear deterrence for 50 years? Leave your answer below. And if this story moved you, if you learned something today that you did not know before, hit that like button and subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of history that deserves to be heard, and there is so much more of it to tell.